Giles Scott-Smith, who is a senior researcher with the Roosevelt Study Center in Middelburg in the Netherlands. Very nice place, which I visited a long time ago. We don't want to say when exactly. And Giles holds the Ernst Beugel Chair in the diplomatic history of transatlantic relations since World War II at Leiden University, also a very nice place, but I haven't visited yet, but maybe someday. Giles, since this year, has been devoted in
I don't know if it was spoke to.
Yes, or anyway,
Yeah.
it was the
Catapulted.
to the chair of Transatlantic Studies Association. He has published many different books, so you can just check his CV and discovers a lot about transatlantic relations, and he's now taken an interest also in Asia. And he says it's refreshing because otherwise, you're cataloging one, transatlantic person, but actually there are wider interests, and it's prompted him to reflect on his specialty also in transatlantic relations. So it's a good thing that he brought you here to think about the Asian Pacific.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And so I'm sure we'll have a stimulating discussion afterwards that's going to, again, promise more thinking on your side, and also perhaps lead to collaborations in the future. So welcome, Giles, to this.
Thank you. Thanks.
It's not your first time here, though.
No. I actually went to high school in Australia. It was a long time ago. Yeah, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thanks for coming to this. This is really, what I want to do is really a think piece. I was thinking of this along the lines of a workshop. So that not kind of presenting a paper at a conference, but I'm really looking forward to engage with people at the European and the Asian centres. I didn't realise that the two centres were so close together, so that's really nice. As Pascaline said, yeah, my background is really transatlantic studies, Cold War, post-Cold War related, looking at the interests that have bonded what was, of course, Western Europe and North America for a large chunk of that, and how that has fed into the post-Cold War era. And what is particularly interesting is how that is gradually fraying at the edges and fragmenting. There is a great effort to maintain it in the rhetoric, but there's no doubt, I think, that the old idea of the transatlantic relationship, or even older idea of the Atlantic community, is starting to look rather old and out of date. So that really triggered an interest in what's going on in this part of the world, and how the transatlantic knowledge network, if you like, the think tanks, the opinion makers, the media, have been looking at developments here in the context of US-EU relations. And I suddenly became intrigued in how it was framed. And that's really the lead up to what I want to talk about for a bit this afternoon. So the initial trigger, inevitably, is of course the so-called Asian pivot announced by Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama towards the end of 2011. And it was soon reframed without the word pivot, replacing it with the word rebalancing, which was, I think, intended to be slightly more neutral for Europeans as much as for the Asia Pacific community. But it really, the point is that it's the apparent shift in US policy that has triggered reactions from Europe, from here, and that's really the key. Had a lot to do, of course, with Obama's transition away, wanting to get out of the major wars of the Bush era in South Asia, wanting to make the expression of US power around the globe more mobile, shifting from large-scale intervention to what has been termed the light footprint. Also, of course, a heavily debt-ridden nation, the United States. It had to do with economic revival, it had to do with the recognition that if we're going to search for a region of growth, then it's going to be the Asia-Pacific region, apparently. I think it also had to do with the frustration of the transatlantic relationship itself. There's a lot of talk about whether NATO has a future these days. If it does, it's going to be a very different kind of NATO. one only has to look at the defence spending amongst the NATO members to see what an enormous chasm there is between the United States and the other European members. I think if you look at the amount of states that managed to achieve 2%, which is meant to be the NATO norm, 2% of GDP on defence spending, you can count them on less than one hand. I think it's US, UK, I think Greece is there. UK only just makes it at the moment. Greece and some lists include Albania, for instance. So it's hardly a hard-hitting community there. And the hope that it would shift more into a kind of smart defence organisation with the pooling of defence tasks, the idea of saying, okay, we cut down on budgets, but we don't cut back on expertise or defence industry capability. There are examples of that, but it's minimal. And I think there is an American sense of, we have a certain amount of tolerance, but we're not going to put up this forever. I mean, when Robert Gates left as NATO Secretary General, June 2011, his last speech in Brussels was a remarkable document. He was saying things like NATO is on the point of being a collective military relevance now. You don't want an American NATO Secretary General leaving with those words. So hence the Asian century in late 2011. Two principal components, I think. The shift of US military focus towards the Pacific, the idea of having 60% of naval and air force assets in the region by 2020, which is quite considerable, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of course, the economic component, the idea of not just free trade, but economic norms, the idea of basically expanding, solidifying, embedding liberal internationalism in the Asia-Pacific region, building on existing alliances, expanding them, and of course with the US in a key leadership role. So it's, I see it really as Obama's idea of the new frontier. John F. Kennedy had that kind of thinking. He was thinking, of course, of space. But Obama's idea of I think the great thing about the United States is the ability to revive national energies towards a new goal, which other nations, can't do so well. Of course, all the focus of this has been on where does China fit. Is it directed against China? Is it about containing China? There's been a lot of soft sell going on. One has to say it's been going on quite well. Military visits by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to Beijing, high-level visits. There was that very nice Obama-Xi short sleeves, walking in the California sunshine meeting in the summer. All looks very nice, very good. I mean, the hope of the Americans is that, of course, China can be incorporated into this liberal internationalist system of institutions as basically taking its rightful place. And I think the Americans are genuine that they would like China to take a role. The shifts in leadership at the top of the International Monetary Fund is very revealing. US pressure on the European nations to basically reduce their voting power, to increase the Asian representation, which is not nothing. But, of course, the edifice, the institutions, will essentially remain how they were in the period before China was on the rise. So that's the big question. Does China want to fit into that existing Western framework? The other thing, of course, though, and this really remains to be tested, is serious US involvement changes what were regional disputes, South China Sea, East China Sea, potentially, into global disputes. And this is something which Beijing, I think, is not particularly happy about. That's their backyard, that's their immediate neighbourhood. What is regional should stay regional, because then they feel to be in the prominent position. They don't want that multilateralised in the way that the Americans are thinking. How that pans out, we will have to see, but there's a definite intent there. Of course, there are problems with this. Potential for conflict. I mean, one remarkable thing about the Pentagon is that it does a lot of its planning in the public sphere. So everyone knows that inevitably plans are being developed for some kind of military capability to, shall we say, disarm Chinese options for preventing all access by the US military. This is something that Doesn't happen behind closed doors. It's quite a remarkable feature of the US system. It is sometimes too public for its own good. So it doesn't mean that the US is going to attack China by any means. It just means that, like any large-scale military, they plan for every eventuality, even if it's not going to happen. But obviously this has psychological impacts. So far, of course, it's just been US-China. It sets up the US rebalancing or US pivot as if it's some increasingly important clash between two heavyweights. What about the EU? Well, this is where my interest came in, because there has been talk of a so-called European Union pivot to the Asia-Pacific region as well. There has been some evidence for this, that it has some meaning. There was the Hillary Clinton, Catherine Ashton joint statement at the Asia Regional Forum last year. Catherine Ashton talked of an Asian semester in the second half of 2012. There was a sense that the American move had triggered a response from the European Union, as if to say, okay, we have to get involved here too. Of course, that raises questions. What is really behind the EU's sudden decision to take these steps? Before we look at that question in more detail, just to consider what assets does the EU have should it want to raise its profile and try and achieve something in this part of the world. There are various which, of course, most of you will be familiar with. I think the asset of being able to display a peaceful system, of literally being to say, okay, we can overcome history. It's not possible to be held hostage to centuries-old antagonisms. They can be overcome, and the existence of the EU is the best evidence. The single market, of course, the trading power of the EU market has considerable weight. Expertise in multinational negotiation and governance. This is also something that can be claimed as relatively unique in the global system. An alternative voice to the United States, so that the West is not just perceived as one big bloc following Washington, but there are different voices which perhaps can have different outcomes. A value-based identity, democracy, human rights is, of course, promoted a lot. Whether it adds up to something in practice is another matter, but at least it is definable. And lastly, I would add development aid. I believe the EU is the largest development donor in the region. This also has a certain social capital if it is, of course, used well, and that people who receive it know where it comes from. There's no point in giving out loads of development aid if the source and purpose is not clear. And from what I gather, I'm not sure that EU development aid is used as well as it could be in that respect. So what does the EU want? What's it after? If it's going after a pivot, what would it try and achieve? Well, firstly, it would fit broadly within the US hope for a rule-based international system. Peaceful resolution of conflicts within the economic and the political sphere. Obviously, development of democracy, rule of law in a broad sense may play out differently according to the particular nations in the region, but again, it's fitting within the US model. Regional integration is, of course, a unique aspect, and that might be focused more on the ASEAN nations, something which the United States might support, but which the EU could claim special expertise on. Sustainable responses to global challenges. There are many particular policy areas in that field. Obviously, climate change would be fairly close to the list, top of the list. And conflict resolution, and the EU has claimed some expertise in Philippines and in Indonesia, where it can say yes as a relatively neutral actor in a sense of compared to the United States. It can achieve certain small-scale local conflict resolution successes which otherwise would not occur. So there's something there perhaps. However, let's look at whether this is actually a credible position that it can claim. The one thing that really intrigues me is how a lot of the writings on the EU as an international actor really present it as if it's straightforward, a unitary actor, an actor that is more or less acting as a nation state, but it's not a nation state, as if it has a clear foreign policy with a clear set of goals. But does it really? Does it really act with all its parts moving towards the same target. I mean, there's even some interesting literature on the EU possessing a grand strategy. Very persuasive, I must say. I mean, it's basically adding up all the capabilities, economic, political, diplomatic, cultural, and saying, yes, if you put all of these together, and you look at the essential goals that the EU is aiming for, one can claim that it has a great strategy, even though it is not a nation state, which is quite a unique setup. Yet, I find that really wishful thinking. It's hard to, if you really look at the facts on the ground, it's hard to really say that what is actually said in the EU documents about what it wants to achieve and how to achieve it, but the actual outcome does still add up to a grand strategy. There's problems with that. One only has to look at the External Action Service, I feel, to have some serious concerns about the EU, how the EU is acting as an international actor. There is enough evidence in this part of the world to show that while the External Action Service has the best interests at heart, it is on the whole being undermined on a regular basis by the very member states it should be, if not taking over from, at least representing. And there's quite clear cases, I think, in the sense of Germany and China, where Germany has taken on a role in the last couple of years as, in many ways, the principal diplomatic interlocutor, without any agreement between Brussels and Germany that they would do that role. It simply is the most prominent actor for the Chinese. You've also got the fact of the, dare I say, rather awkward diplomatic presence of the EU when it goes on the road. The troika of Van Rompuy, Barroso and Ashton, with all the delegations that come with them, is a rather cumbersome unit. With all respect, it's difficult to present a kind of single voice, united front when you have, when it looks as if you're taking over the conference table. It can be a bit intimidating, I think. So you, instead of the EU functioning as a unitary actor, it's opening itself up for divide and rule. Member states being played off against member states against Brussels, and I think China and Russia really has started to play that game. I don't think that it's not that they particularly wanted to play that game, but the opportunity was there. So another problem I think which has come out, I feel, is again, dare I say, a certain superiority complex. There is a certain sense that the EU is the unique best example of regional integration. Therefore, it is able to not just inform, but to an extent teach others how they might resolve their conflicts by going down the same path. That, I feel, in current global circumstances, is becoming increasingly problematic. There has to be a certain reality check, I feel, because audiences are not going to accept that forever. And I think even a regional grouping like ASEAN is starting to struggle with the idea that the EU would be a model for where they want to go in the future. There should be a certain reflection. 10 years ago, perhaps, things were very different. The euro had been introduced. There was a lot of talk of and evidence of the euro rivaling the US dollar as key currency in the global system. The enlargement in the early 2000s, making the EU into a very sizable bloc. Yes, there was still at that point a great deal of optimism, EU constitution debate aside. Now, a few years on into the euro crisis, there's that idea of the EU being able to lecture others, I think needs a certain self-reflection. Last problem, there was a very interesting report by the Dutch Foreign Affairs Institute, Klingendahl, a couple of months ago, really taking a hard look at to what extent the EU has been able to promote effective multilateralism. Now, effective multilateralism is one of the pillars of the security strategy. One of the key points that the EU thinks it can promote where others are unable to. And the report really is quite damning. It's basically saying you can't promote effective multilateralism if there's no coordination, if there's no communication, if there's no real direction from the centre in a sense of a standard foreign policy strategy. And it's it's also not possible if you haven't got a diplomatic service to push that idea. So even that element, which could be claimed as a unique item in the diplomatic arsenal, actually is rebounding. So this is, it's pretty serious result. So does talk of an EU pivot make sense? The idea of greater EU engagement in this part of the world? Well, we can go through several factors and see how they add up. Yes, in the sense that it would strengthen the relationship with the United States. I mean, there seems to be a great hope and wish from Washington that the EU would support the Obama-Clinton, as it was then, strategy. It would breathe new life into NATO. There's plenty of talk from various people saying NATO can only survive if it starts getting involved in the Pacific. Because then it will mean something to the Americans, whereas now it's increasingly not doing so. And it would also strengthen the idea of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership in relation to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because there is a rivalry opening up since the Transatlantic, the TTIP negotiations were opened. There is a certain amount of competition between those two tracks of economic negotiations going on in a way, Transatlantic versus Trans-Pacific, and there is question marks there over which way the Americans are going to go in terms of trying to negotiate the quickest deal. Serious question marks. A negative thing about strengthening the relationship with the United States is it raises questions about, well, to what extent is the EU really interested then in developing a strategy for the Asia Pacific? Is the engagement with the Asia Pacific purely based on getting a better seat at the table with Washington? And I think that is a very interesting element in the literature. Yeah, if we want to mean something for the Americans, we have to get involved in that other region. Well, that's kind of ignoring the actual what's already going on in that region and how they can actually play a role there. The EU could, of course, increase its presence and impact in the region. It could engage more with groupings like ASEAN. This comes back to the point of to what extent the EU can do that without reflecting on its reduced status in the world, or the reduced status of Europe in the world, if you put it that way. Yes, an EU pivot would be a good idea for solidifying existing trade ties, maybe expanding various free trade agreements. The answer to that is, well, is a pivot really needed? I mean, that's what the EU is doing already, so there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with continuing the existing strategy. It could complete the existing strategic partnerships. There's a very interesting list of 10 or so strategic partnerships with key countries around the world, which of course here includes China, India, Japan and South Korea. What's very interesting about that, though, is there was a very good study by a Madrid-based think tank, Frida, which really went through all of the strategic partnerships and said, okay, what are the components that they were made up of, what were the goals set when they were written, and what is their status now? And going through them is very interesting because they're all basically half finished. And they're all kind of stuck, as with India, as with China. It began with a lot of optimism in the early mid-2000s, it's kind of run aground because of disagreements. And in the end, you do start to doubt the word strategic in the phrase strategic partnerships. There doesn't seem to be any linkage between these. It's simply a case of, you have one of the BRICS or another nation rising up the economic hierarchy. We need a strategic partnership with them. It's completely reactive. The strategy should, of course, be combining assets towards a certain goal. It's not evident. It's not evident in that review. Lastly, perhaps, a pivot would replicate the US example. It would give the EU a greater sense of intent. It would give it a new mission, which I think is behind the US, the Obama-Clinton idea of an Asian pivot. That's all very well. Maybe that's an interesting idea, but one wonders if the euro should not be sorted out categorically first before launching into some kind of exercise halfway around the world with unknown goals. So, after that kind of brief assessment, I think one has to conclude whether the EU goes for a pivot or not, it cannot act or behave in this part of the world as if it is an equal power to China and the United States. The idea of some kind of troika, international troika, which has been, or trilateralism I should say, which has been floated in some reports as a kind of, it used to be called the G3, and now it's called trilateralism. It doesn't really hold water. I think there is a need for the EU to perhaps step back and say, yeah, that's not going to happen. So what other options might there be? And I'd just like to throw out a few ideas here to wrap this up. Of course, we've had option one, which is basically fit into the US-led liberal internationalism, which is what the US wants. That is, of course, an option, and that, to a certain extent that is happening, although there is a certain reticence, despite some public claims to the contrary. One interesting aspect of that is that there is clearly some nations in Southeast Asia and elsewhere who actually like the fact that the EU is not a military power, that the EU has no direct stake in security questions in the region, that for that reason it has a greater credibility, that it won't get drawn into these conflicts. So whereas some, if you like, pro-NATO camps say the lack of a decent common security and defence policy is just a disaster for the EU as an international actor, but actually others who are saying, it can be a major advantage. You have to be aware of the power of diplomacy. It doesn't always require hard power. Another option is certainly develop the External Action Service as a genuine diplomatic apparatus. And this is not going to happen overnight. I realise that. It's only been going a couple of years. There were question marks, very serious question marks early on about its mandate, about how we're fitted with the existing member state diplomatic networks. I think the problem is, whereas a lot of things with the EU, if not everything with the EU, is in gradual transition and in a state of becoming, I don't believe that you can have a diplomatic network in a gradual state of gradual becoming because its credibility goes out the window. You can only run a diplomatic service for so long without it being able to say what it says and back it up with action. It has to be directly connected to the decision-making centre. Otherwise you're going to have problems with recruitment, with credibility, with expertise, and with audience, who are at some point not going to want to engage with it as they do with other member state diplomacies. It could be developed relatively quickly in certain key areas, like give the External Action Service complete control over development aid, give this major policy area from the Commission to the AS. And then you have a major policy tool at its fingertips. That could change its standard very quickly. Another option, I don't know if this makes any sense, but keep the EU bloc as preeminent in terms of trade issues, so free trade agreements and whatnot, but let the states deal with security. So this would essentially be abandoning the too high ambitions of the common security and foreign policy, and saying, look, it's not going to happen. Current defence budgets, short-term, medium-term, are not going to improve. If you look at the EU states that are militarily engaged in terms of planning or in terms of alliances in this part of the world, they're hardly on the table. You've got the French producing defence white papers on the Asia Pacific, but have they got the credibility and the capability to make that stick? You have the British in close alliance, increasingly close alliance with Japan, that could go in interesting directions. But beyond that, it's difficult to see how there can be any real serious EU military component. So obviously this would require a major re-evaluation of what the EU is there for and where it thinks it might be going. But how long can you go along without with claiming something and not being able to back it up and still remain credible? There's the option of focusing on new partnerships beyond trade. One interesting aspect of the Asia-Pacific region is the rising importance of so-called middle powers, where one could include Australia or Indonesia or the Philippines. And maybe to think about creating a kind of second tier framework, maybe overlapping existing international organizations like ASEAN, certainly fitting in the broader organizations like APEC and so on, and not necessarily creating a new international organization. That's a step too far. What would it be based on? But simply thinking about, okay, how could the EU utilize, like I say, a kind of second tier framework. Again, it begs the question of, okay, what would the strategy be? What would the goal be? But I think it would be a step in the right direction in terms of the EU kind of downgrading its idea of, okay, it is a major player in the region that we want to engage and maybe assist with certain powers who are themselves going through a change in status. The last one, this intrigues me. And this really came up from the conference in Canberra just the last couple of days. And it stems from this problem of how do you run a diplomacy and public diplomacy campaign, if you like, when you're not a unitary actor, when different elements of your organisation are giving different messages and perhaps undermining the other. And it's the best way I can describe it is to what extent is it possible to present a disaggregated diplomacy? To what extent would it be possible to develop a kind of multi-level diplomacy where there is an awareness that coherence is not always going to be achievable? Now, there's a lot of talk in IR literature about the disaggregated state and how different elements of the state apparatus are active on the international level, and it doesn't always necessarily add up to the classic model of the unitary actor. So in other words, instead of looking at the EU and constantly assuming that it will act as a nation state, going the opposite way and saying, no, actually, it doesn't and it won't for the foreseeable future, so therefore is it not somehow better to take advantage of this first looks rather disparate communication. In other words, the EU stops pretending to be what it's not and tries to take advantage of what it is. And the only thing I can think of in those terms is to what extent it could work to facilitate the linkages of others. In other words, the EU diplomacy would become a kind of a network of epistemic communities, trying to facilitate linkages, policy-effective linkages across a whole range of areas, but simply moving away from any talk of this kind of grand strategy stuff and the EU as a potential great power. So trying to plug into what its partners actually need and want, and what the EU can provide, because the EU can provide it